Good morning, everybody. How we doing? Awesome. Well, I'm always so amazed that when we just sing about something as simple as praising God, how meaningful and deep it is, right? Like, I don't know, it blows me away. You're like, oh, I'm just saying how great God is, and you're just moved so deeply. So it's I don't know, I find the beauty in that simplicity very inspiring. Well, this morning, I'm excited to be continuing our series on love and commands. And last week, if you weren't with us, you can actually watch it on YouTube if you would like to. And if you don't want to do that, I understand. So you're just going to have to jump in and hope you follow. And if I did a good enough job, it should be easy to do that. We'll find out. But last week, what we did is we explored this idea of Jesus as our command giver in John 14:15, where Jesus says, "If you love me, you will obey my commandments." We explored some surrounding verses, but the themes we went over was Jesus has the authority to give commands because he is God. We looked at how Jesus' love is the base for our new commandments. And we looked at how that scene in John 13 to 14 is kind of mirroring Exodus 20 when God reveals himself on the mountain, gives the Ten Commandments. Jesus reveals himself to the disciples and gives the new commandment. And we also went over two important definitions. We went over the word that is used for commandments, and that one was pretty straightforward. Nothing flashy and overly fancy about that one. It's basically what you'd expect. It's an instruction on what to do. But the cool thing about that word was that it almost always referenced the Old Testament when it was being used. The other word, love, is a lot more of an interesting word when it comes to definitions because love is a lot more exciting to flesh out as a definition. This is what we said about the definition of love, that this version of the word love does not denote affection or romantic attachment. It rather denotes caring love, a deliberate attitude of mind that concerns itself with the well-being of the loved one. Self-devotion, not self-satisfaction, is its dominant trait. We can also kind of add in this idea of sacrificial love as well. So what we're going to be doing is that is a very quick recap of last week. So if you don't want to listen to all 20-something minutes, you can just listen to the 2 minutes this week, and then hopefully that'll be enough. We're going to be looking at Matthew 22, 34 to 40, if you want to turn there. And what we're going to be looking at is Jesus answering some Pharisees. And Jesus has been at the temple. This is where we're jumping into Matthew. He's at the temple, and all day, the religious leaders have been trying to trip him up. They've been trying to ask him questions to kind of keep him on his toes and see if this great teacher is really that great. So he stumps the Sadducees when they ask him about resurrection, and this is what he says, this is what the Pharisees say after, in Matthew 22:34. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked a question to test him. "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." So Jesus answers correctly, and he, which is good. But he also is referencing two Old Testament passages. He's referencing Deuteronomy 6:5, that's the first part, where he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind." And the second part, which is, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," is from Leviticus 19:18. And this is a quick little rabbit trail. The trail leads to the hole, right? Is that a common question if you're ever talking with people who are not familiar with the faith is they'll say, well, which Old Testament commandments do you need to follow as a Christian? Because almost all of us are wearing shirts with mixed linens, right? So a good test is to see which Old Testament commandments are repeated in the New Testament in a prescriptive way. Okay? So this is a great example of Jesus repeating two Old Testament commandments in a prescriptive way that we can walk confidently saying, okay, I can love my neighbor, and I can love God, and I can wear cotton and polyester, okay? So you can take that, okay? Another fun fact about this verse is that it is the exact same words for love and commandments that we found in John 14:15. Right? So as we walk forward in this verse, our definition of love and commandments, if you notice how the commandments reference the Old Testament law again, we can walk forward knowing we're in the same ballpark, and so we can take those definitions forward. So this verse also kind of works as a nice picture frame, right? You can put this up in a nice plaque. You can put it on your wall somewhere. And it's beautiful, and it's simple, though it begs a question, right? A very central question is, what does it mean to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind? Right? It asks what those questions mean, what those things are. What is your heart, your soul, and your mind? And I know we've already gone through a lot of definitions, maybe too many definitions, but because this is a highly personal question, how we live out love and how we live out sacrificial love or self-devotional love is kind of dependent on our personality, right? And our circumstances. It'll look different for all of us. I think it would be helpful if we went over at least some definition of what heart is. All right, we'll start there. So this is what I found, and it was summarized, and I thought it was helpful. The Hebrews thought in terms of subjective experience rather than objective scientific observation, and thereby avoided the modern error of over-departmentalization. It was essentially the whole man, with all of his attributes, physical, intellectual, and psychological, of which the Hebrew thought and spoke when the heart was conceived. It was also conceived as the governing center for all of these things. It is the heart which makes a man or a beast what he is and governs all his actions. Character, personality, will, and mind are modern terms which all reflect something of the meaning of heart in its biblical usage. And it's kind of a lengthy definition, but you get this kind of all-encompassing picture, right, of what heart can mean. And what I really liked here is that it says the heart was conceived as the governing center for all of those attributes that we talked about. So we can look at this verse in Matthew, because we're going to be focusing on the first bit, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind today. We could maybe reframe it like this, with this kind of question is, how do we love God with the center of our beings? We can look at it as in saying that the great commandment that Jesus gives us is to love God with our whole being, with all dimensions of our being. And remember, we can look into what our definition of love is, right? So let's keep that in mind. It's a deliberate attitude of caring, right? It's one that is sacrificial. It's one that is not for self-satisfaction, right? It's about actively participating in a caring relationship, right? And last week when we went over our definitions of commandment, we looked at it in terms of human relationships, and I thought, well, let's look at this idea of loving someone with your very center, with all of your being in human relationships. Now, hopefully, there are a couple people in your life that you love this way, with your whole being, right? And hopefully not too many at the same time. Because, well, that would just be exhausting, and you would find boundaries very difficult in your life, right? So I was thinking of some examples, right, that come to mind that are easy. Spouse, kids, parents, maybe a best friend or two if you're lucky to have one. Maybe a dog. Some people really love dogs, and hopefully not a cat. Because as much as you love them, I promise you they just don't feel the same way about you, okay? It's just one-sided, okay? So let's look at family, right? You don't get to pick the family you were born into, right? Later in life, you can pick who you call family, but the family you grow up in is largely out of your hands. And when I was working with youth, one of my favorite things to do was try to remind them that their parents loved them. And one of the ways that I like to do this that was kind of subtle was the parent or grandparent activity or hat as taxi driver. Right? The youth kids are very busy these days, right? Tons of activities, lots of going around. And there's just a lot of driving. So sometimes the night of a parent or grandparent can be pick up kid A, drop them off at their activity, then go to drop off kid B at their activity, then wait 30 minutes, drive back, pick up the other one, pick up the next one, and then go home, right? It's exhausting and tiring, right? And so what I like to do is I like to remind the youth that that is not a fun time, right? And that the parents actually generally don't enjoy sitting in the car for 2 or 3 hours, but they do it because they care about them, right? And it's kind of a silly example, I get it, but it's a small way that we can see that the parents will sacrificially give themselves for the people that they love, all right? They are making a deliberate choice to concern themselves with the well-being of another person, to use our definition, right? Well, let's look at it in a marriage. When you exchange vows, you are using this definition of marriage, right? It's a deliberate attitude of mind, right? That's concerning itself with someone else. So let's look at some of the things you vow. In sickness, in health, when you're poor or rich, right? It may be easy to love someone when they're rich. It's harder when they're poor. And if you suffer colds like I do, or like most men tend to do, it can be difficult to love them, from what I've been told. Right? When you choose to forsake all other people, you are intentionally, deliberately choosing one person over everyone else. Right? So that's baked into the idea of marriage. Right? And hopefully, if you're in a good marriage, you will put the other person's needs before your own more often than not. Right? Because, well, we're not perfect, and that's very difficult to do every day. Right? But what's really cool about marriage, and even about family, and all these relationships where you are giving of your whole being, it is not just a one-way thing, hopefully. Right? It is often a two-way relationship. Right? You are shaped into the person that you are giving your love to when you receive back from them the same thing. When I had lunch with Bernie, the tall guy who preached here a while ago, he used to be my theology professor 15 years ago when I was in school, which I know I'm not old, but I feel old when I say that I was in university 15 years ago, so please don't hold that against me. But we were having coffee, and we were talking about organizational systems and all this kind of stuff, and I was sharing how I was excited about them. And when he was driving me home, I said, Bernie, do you think that 15 years, all those years ago when I was in school, you would ever think that I would be excited about organizational systems? And he laughed and he said, well, you married well. right. Because my wife loves Excel and all those things that I think are terribly boring. Right? But she gets excited when she puts together spreadsheets, which is insane to me. But it has rubbed off on me and has shaped me and helped me grow into a person that can be excited about some aspects of those things. Right? In the same way that whoever you surround yourself with, you become like. So it doesn't have to be a spouse. It can be your family. It can be your friends. And hopefully, you're starting to see some parallels to our relationship with God in all of these examples. Because what Jesus modeled is a self-giving covenant of love. Right? All these human relationships, we can see the amazing transformative effects it has. And one of the beautiful things about this verse is that when it says love God with all your heart, it's not just a one-way devotion. Right? It's not like worshiping a deity who gives nothing back, who requires you to pour yourself out with just entirely and hope that maybe you will be seen. But God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son so that we would be made right before him and be transformed into his likeness. So loving God with your whole heart, your whole being, isn't just pouring out, but it's actually receiving God's love as well. Remember that commandment that we looked at last week when Jesus said, my new commandment is that you are to love one another? And the key line is, just as I have loved you. So the more we love God with all of our being, the more we lay down at his feet, the more we are built up by his love for us. As we trust God with our whole being, we start to become more like him. The more I love my wife and live in that, the more I'm shaped by her. And now, I do want to be clear here and add a little thing, is that in our relationships, we know people, we have experienced this, when we give ourselves this way, sometimes it is not honored. And when we talk about loving God this way, it can be really difficult because giving of your whole self, your whole heart, is risky. You're trusting your whole being with somebody. And the mistakes we make with other people can cause deep and serious wounds. So if you have experienced that, then I just want to let you know that God is not like that. He will honor your gift and your sacrifice because his love is genuine and is perfect. So I think we're getting the idea, right? We have a rough idea of what loving God with your whole heart is, intentionally choosing, deliberately giving yourself to God. So as I was continuing to prepare for this morning, I was like, okay, soul is next. I was like, oh man, I'm 15 minutes in, and I've done one of the attributes. I don't think we have all after. I mean, we could be here all afternoon, but we would rather eat food than listen to me talk. So I was like, okay, let's quickly find some definitions of some other pieces. And as I was doing that, I came across this one comment by a commentator. He said, Deuteronomy 6:5, remember that's the verse that Jesus quotes in that first part. He says, does not describe separate compartments of the self, but emphasizes that a person must love God with his whole being, with every capacity at his command. I was like, well, that's not helpful. I would like to please make 3 clean distinctions, like every good sermon should have, right? 3 key points. And then I was like, okay, well, I'll look at the Hebrew word for soul, and I thought maybe that'll help give me some insight and I can make a point about it. And then this is what I found when I was looking at the word soul. This term, in the context of loving God, refers to the inner person, can be understood as the source of appetites, emotions, intelligence. It represents a deeply personal aspect of the individual's being, encompassing one's mind, reason, and will. I was like, oh man, this is not off to a good start. Because once again, it's this big picture. The use of the word soul in this verse, in 6:5, underscores the importance of loving God with one's entire being, including one's intellectual and mental facilities. I was like, crap. Okay, it's not helping. It's not going the way that I would like it to go. So I was like, okay, I'm going to look up soul in the Greek, in the New Testament, and maybe I'll find something there. Right? So this is what I found. In the New Testament, the soul is portrayed in a similar way as the Old Testament. And is the seat of the desire and will. It is also the seat of emotions. It may represent the whole personality. The soul often refers to the whole life of a person. And again, I just kept running into the same issue. I kept hitting this brick wall where I wanted to make a clean 3-point thing. But all of these definitions, all of these things were reinforcing the idea of what we talked about in the heart. Our whole self, our center. So what I realized is I was trying to focus on living out the verse practically, because that was my hope. I wanted to make practical steps for us to follow. But I was missing and I was de-emphasizing what the center of the passage was. Right? I was hoping to bring specific ways for us to live out that subjective experience of how we can love God. How fun would it have been if I had like the top 5 ways to love God, right? How easy and nice that would have been to have a list of. But instead, I was reminded when I was thinking about this, I feel like God reminded me of this. Whenever you want to learn a new skill, you see the really cool, flashy, advanced things, and you're like, man, that looks awesome. I'm going to try that. And then you fail terribly because you don't understand the basics, right? Like in volleyball, for example, that's the sport I know best. When you're coaching, what you want to look for in a player, especially a hitter, an outside hitter, is do they want to pass first before they hit the ball, right? Because if they're not passing well, then the ball doesn't go to the setter, and then they can't hit, right? So if you don't work on the basics, well, then all these cool things that you want to do down the road just are not applicable. So our basics needs to be solidified over and over again. So when I was thinking about the practical application for this morning, I thought, well, let's just ask those questions. We've been singing all morning about worshiping God and praising Him for who He is. So we can ask ourselves, in my relationship with God, am I actually living out this definition of love that we've talked about? Is it an intentional, self-giving relationship where I am sacrificially loving Him with the center of my being? Right? And that leads into the next question. Are we actually putting God at the center of our life? Does our life revolve around Him? Right? Or is He just an addition that when things go kind of sideways, we're like, oh man, God, you got to get in here. And then the third question I thought was, for those of us who have been in the faith for a long time, am I putting too much emphasis on the mechanics of my relationship with God, but missing the heart of it? Right? Am I trying to find these cool ways to make God applicable in my life, but actually missing what God is trying to tell me? Right? Am I trying to find this quick list of 5 things that I can love God like with my own personality, but what I've then done is I've regulated God to a section of my life and not the center anymore? So this morning, and I think our worship this morning was a perfect example of that, is it's simple. This morning when we were singing, we were just acknowledging God for who He is and putting Him in His right place. Right? It can be, so if you're looking for practical application this week, just do that every morning. Simple. But that's what I want us to try this week, is ask yourself those questions. I'll say them one more time. Am I living out a self-giving relationship with God? Am I loving God sacrificially? Am I purposely choosing God? Am I really putting God at the heart and the center of my life? And the third one is, am I putting too much emphasis on the mechanics of my relationship, but missing the heart? So the worship team is going to come up. We're going to sing one more song. And just sit in praising God, putting Him in His proper place this morning. In Psalm 116, this is a response from the psalmist who, in response to God's love in him, he says, I love the Lord because He has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy. Because He inclined His ear to me, therefore I will call on Him as long as I live. The snares of death encompassed me, the pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. Then I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Our Lord is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. When I was brought low, He saved me. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has been good with you. For you delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. So let's walk with the Lord in the land this week. God, thank you so much for who you are. Thank you for what you have done for us, what you continue to do for us. And God, thank you that your commandment is to love you. And in that process, it's not just an emptying, but it's a filling. So God, help us, show us where we need to recenter you. In our devotions, in our prayer, as we spend time with you, God. Help us to show what we need to give. And God, importantly, show us what we need to receive from you this week. God, we love you, and we are so thankful and undeserving of your love.